The last two potatoes sat on the rough-hewn shelf, small and withered, their skins loose like the clothes on her children. An Lee looked at them, then at the nearly empty sack of flour beside them. That was it. That was to be their Christmas feast in the bitter winter of 1878 in a town called Jericho Springs that offered neither comfort nor water to her kind. The wind howled outside their small, drafty cabin, a constant mourner for a life she had lost and a future she could not see. Her twin daughters, Lynn and Sue, were 7 years old, their faces too thin, their dark eyes too large. They sat huddled together on the single mattress in the corner, a threadbare blanket pulled up to their chins. They were trying to be brave, a lesson learned too early, but An Lee could see the tremor in their small bodies, a vibration of cold and hunger. Her husband, Bao, had been strong and warm, a man whose laughter could fill a room, but the mountain had taken him in a rock slide at the silver mine 6 months ago, and with him it had taken the laughter, the warmth, and the food. Now all An Lee had was his homestead claim, a piece of paper that meant little to the hostile townsfolk who saw her as a ghost left behind by the departed railroad crews. She took in laundry for pennies, her hands raw and chapped from lye soap and icy water, but it was never enough. "Mama," Sue whispered, her voice as thin as a winter reed, "tell us the story of the Monkey King again." An Lee forced a smile, turning from the bleakness of the shelf. She went to them, her knees cracking as she knelt on the cold floorboards. She tucked the blanket tighter around their shoulders, the worn wool scratching her chapped fingers. "The Monkey King," she began, her voice a low, soothing murmur, "was born from a stone egg on the mountain of flowers and fruit. He was clever and brave, and he could fly on a cloud and change his shape 72 ways." As she spoke, weaving a tapestry of words to cover the bare walls of their reality, a sharp, sudden knock echoed through the cabin. It was not the timid rap of a neighbor. It was a solid, heavy sound, like a fist against the wood. The girls fell silent, their eyes wide with fear. No one ever came to their door, especially not after dark on Christmas Eve. The men from the town sometimes passed by, their gazes lingering with a mixture of contempt and something worse. An Lee's heart hammered against her ribs. She rose slowly, placing a finger to her lips to quiet the girls. She crept to the door, her bare feet silent on the floor. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer, only the relentless shriek of the wind. After a long moment, the knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. It was the sound of a man who would not be ignored. Taking a shallow breath, An Lee lifted the heavy wooden bar and pulled the door open just a crack. The man standing on her stoop was a wall against the swirling snow. He was tall and broad, wrapped in a heavy, snow-dusted greatcoat. A low-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but she could see a weathered jaw and the hard line of his mouth. A gun belt was cinched around his waist, the handle of a Colt pistol dark and menacing against his hip. He was a white man, a gunslinger by the look of him, the kind of man who brought trouble like a shadow. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. He did not speak. He simply met her gaze, and in his free hand he held up a burlap sack, bulging and heavy. From his other hand, dangling by its bound feet, was a plucked turkey, its pale skin luminous in the faint light spilling from her cabin. He tilted his head slightly, a silent gesture toward the cold, empty room behind her. He was not asking for shelter. He was offering a feast. An Lee stared, her mind unable to bridge the gap between the terror he inspired and the impossible charity he held in his hands. He was a specter of violence offering a miracle, and she did not know which was more dangerous. Her first instinct was to slam the door, to bar it against this inexplicable intrusion, but the weight of her daughter's hunger pressed down on her. The ghost of the 2 small potatoes on the shelf mocked her fear. This man was a threat, but starvation was a certainty. With a hand that shook so badly she could barely control it, she pulled the door wider. The stranger stepped inside, bringing a gust of frigid air with him. He moved with a deliberate, quiet grace that seemed at odds with his size. He placed the sack and the turkey on her small, rickety table. The legs of the table groaned under the sudden weight. He pushed back his hat, revealing a face carved by sun and hardship. His eyes, a pale, startling blue, surveyed the sparse cabin in a single sweeping glance, taking in the empty shelves, the threadbare blanket where the girls hid, and the weariness etched into Anli's face. Still, he said nothing. He unbuttoned his greatcoat. Inside, he was not the ruffian she expected. He wore a simple, clean wool shirt. He moved to the hearth, where the embers of their small fire glowed weakly. With practiced efficiency, he took a few pieces of the precious firewood from her small stack and coaxed the flames back to life. Then he turned back to the table. He untied the sack and began to unload its contents as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Potatoes, plump and fresh, a bag of onions, a tin of coffee, a heavy sack of flour, another of sugar, and a small jar of precious salt. Canned peaches in syrup, a slab of bacon wrapped in oiled paper. It was more food than she had seen in 6 months. It was a fortune. Lynn and Sue peeked out from behind the mattress, their fear slowly being replaced by a wide-eyed wonder. Anli stood frozen, clutching the doorframe. "Why?" she finally managed to whisper, the word barely audible. The man paused, his hands full of potatoes. He looked at her, and for a moment his hard expression softened. He didn't answer with words. He simply gestured to the stove, then to the turkey, a clear indication that he intended to cook it. He was not just delivering the food, he was preparing it. A part of her screamed that this was madness. To let a strange, armed man into her home, to allow him to take over her hearth? But another, deeper part of her, the part that was a mother, was overwhelmed by the sheer, impossible fact of the food. She watched as he found her largest pot, filled it with snow from a bucket by the door to melt for water, and began to peel the potatoes with a knife from his own belt. His hands were large and calloused, but his movements were precise, economical. He worked in silence, and soon the small cabin, which for so long had smelled only of poverty and soap, began to fill with the rich, savory aroma of roasting turkey and onions. The scent was so powerful, so full of warmth and promise, that Anli felt tears welling in her eyes. She did not know his name or his purpose, but for the first time in a long time, her home felt safe from the gnawing hunger outside her door. He was a mystery, but tonight, he was their deliverance. The smell of roasting turkey was an announcement. By Christmas morning, it had seeped through the thin, clapboard walls of the cabin and drifted on the cold air, a declaration of impossible abundance in a place defined by scarcity. It did not go unnoticed. Just as the stranger, whom Anli had started to think of as Jonas after finding the name stitched inside his coat, was pulling the golden-brown bird from the oven, another knock came at the door. This time it was sharp and proprietary, the knock of a man who believed he owned everything he surveyed. Anli's stomach tightened. She knew who it was before she opened it. Mr. Abernathy stood on her porch, a thick, florid man whose wealth was built on foreclosures and intimidation. He owned the general store, the saloon, and held the mortgage on half the homes in Jericho Springs. He had been circling Anli's small homestead claim for months, coveting the creek that ran along its western edge. "Merry Christmas, widow," he said, his voice slick with false piety. His eyes, small and shrewd, darted past her into the cabin, widening at the sight of the feast laid out on the table. He sniffed the air appreciatively. "Well, well, it seems fortune has smiled upon you. Or perhaps something else has." His gaze landed on Jonas, who stood by the hearth, motionless. Abernathy's smile curdled into a sneer. "I see. You found yourself a protector, a man to keep you warm through the winter." Anli flushed with shame and anger. "He is a guest," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "A guest?" Abernathy chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. He took a step forward, intending to enter, but Jonas moved. He didn't move fast. He simply shifted his weight, placing himself squarely in the doorway. He was taller than Abernathy by a head, and his silence seemed to absorb all the sound in the air. He didn't look angry. He just looked. His pale eyes were flat, like chips of ice, and they fixed on Abernathy with an unnerving stillness. Abernathy was a man used to being feared. He puffed out his chest. "This is a private matter between me and the woman. Step aside, drifter." Jonas did not move. He didn't speak. He didn't even blink. He simply held Abernathy's gaze. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. A few townsfolk, drawn by the confrontation, had gathered at a distance, their faces pinched by the cold and their own mean curiosities. They watched, expecting the widow's strange guardian to be run off. Abernathy was the law in Jericho Springs, even if he didn't wear a badge. "I said step aside," Abernathy repeated, his voice rising. He took another step, trying to push past. Jonas raised a hand, not to strike, but simply to block the way. It was a calm, deliberate gesture, but in that moment, Abernathy's eyes fell to the worn grip of the Colt at Jonas's hip, and to the way the man stood, perfectly balanced, utterly at ease. Abernathy was a bully, and like all bullies, his courage was a fragile thing. He saw in Jonas's stillness not weakness, but a deep and patient capacity for violence that his own bluster could never match. The color drained from Abernathy's face. He had misjudged his man. He took a step back, trying to regain his composure. "This isn't over," he sputtered, pointing a fat finger at Anli. "That claim of yours is on shaky ground. The town council has regulations. Decency regulations." He threw one last hateful glare at Jonas. "You've picked the wrong side, friend." With that, he turned and stomped away, his boots crunching angrily in the snow. The small crowd of onlookers dispersed, whispering among themselves. The immediate threat was gone. Anli let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She looked at Jonas, who had already turned back to the fire as if nothing had happened. She had seen him first as a danger, then as a savior. Now she saw something else entirely. A shield. Later that afternoon, after a meal that left Lynn and Sue sleepy and full for the first time in their memory, Jonas went outside to chop more wood for the fire. Anli watched him from the window. He worked with the same silent, rhythmic efficiency he did everything else, the axe rising and falling in a steady beat. The woodpile, which had been perilously small, was growing into a respectable stack. She poured a cup of hot water, a poor substitute for coffee, but it was warm. She bundled herself in her thin shawl and carried it out to him. The air was sharp and clean, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. He stopped his work as she approached, resting the axe head in the snow. "Thank you," she said softly. He took the cup from her, his large fingers brushing against hers. He nodded, his gaze dropping to the cup. As he did, his sleeve pulled back slightly, and for the first time, Anli saw it. On the back of his hand, just above the wrist, was a tattoo. The lines were faded, the ink blurred by time and sun, but the design was unmistakable. It was the coiled tail of a dragon, rendered in a style she had only ever seen in the old country. It was a Chinese symbol, etched into the skin of this silent white gunslinger. The sight of it was so incongruous, so deeply strange, that it sent a jolt through her. It was a piece of a puzzle she didn't know existed, and it changed the shape of every question she had about the man who had appeared out of the storm. That night, a profound quiet settled over the small cabin. The girls were asleep, their bellies full, their dreams peaceful for once. The wind had died down, and the only sounds were the soft crackle of the fire and the rhythmic click of metal on oilcloth. Jonas sat at the table, the lamplight glinting off the pieces of his pistol, which he was meticulously cleaning. An-Li watched him from her stool by the hearth. The dragon tattoo on his hand seemed to pulse in the flickering light. The image was burned into her mind. All day she had wrestled with it, trying to make sense of the contradiction. The man was an enigma, his silence a wall she could not breach. But the tattoo was a key, a clue that hinted at a world beyond the one she saw. She had to know. Gathering every bit of courage she possessed, she decided to take a risk. If he did not understand, he would think her mad. If he did, perhaps the wall would come down. She spoke in her native Mandarin, her voice soft in the quiet room. "Why are you here?" Jonas's hands stilled. He slowly raised his head, his pale eyes finding hers across the room. The expression on his face was one of profound shock, as if she had struck him. He stared at her for a long moment, the silence stretching until it was a physical presence in the room. An-Li's heart sank. She had been wrong. It was just a meaningless picture on his skin. Then he spoke. His voice was rough, unused, but the words were unmistakable. In a halting, heavily accented Mandarin, he answered her question. "I owed a debt." The words hit An-Li with the force of a physical blow. She could only stare, her mind reeling. He continued, his gaze dropping back to the gun parts on the table, as if he could not bear to look at her while he confessed. He told her a story that began 7 years earlier, on a different mountain, in a different winter. He had been a young man then, not a gunslinger, but a freighter, hauling goods over the Sierras. A sudden, violent blizzard had caught him, his wagon lost, his horse dead. He had been wandering, blind and freezing, when he collapsed. He should have died there, but he was found. A Chinese man, part of a crew laying track for the railroad, stumbled upon him. The man, against the judgment of his companions who saw only a white devil, had dragged Jonas back to their meager camp. For a week he nursed him, sharing his own scant rations, forcing hot broth between his frozen lips, saving his life. That man's name was Bao, An-Li's husband. Bao had never told her. It was not his way to speak of his own good deeds. When Jonas was well enough to travel, Bao had walked with him to the nearest settlement. Before they parted, he had pressed a small, smooth stone into Jonas's hand. "The world is large," Bao had said in his own tongue, "but paths cross. If you ever meet my family, see that they are well." Jonas had carried that promise for 7 years. He had drifted, taking work where he could, the world hardening him. He had heard whispers of Bao settling with a wife in Wyoming, and he had followed the rumors from one mining camp to the next. He had arrived in Jericho Springs 2 weeks ago, only to learn he was too late. Bao was dead. He had spent the last 2 weeks watching from a distance, seeing her struggle, seeing the hunger in her children's faces. His silence wasn't born of menace, but of shame. He felt he had failed his oath. He had arrived in time to witness her suffering, not to prevent it. He reached into the breast pocket of his shirt and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. He opened it and tipped the contents into his palm. It was the stone Bao had given him, a simple gray river stone polished smooth by time and water. On its surface was a single crudely carved Chinese character, Ren. patience, endurance, fortitude. An Lee got up and walked to the table. She looked down at the stone, then at the man who had carried it across a territory and across 7 years of his life. The wall of his silence had crumbled, and in its place was a story of loyalty and honor that left her breathless. He was not a stranger. He was a promise, kept. Their newfound peace was shattered 3 days later. A notice was nailed to their front door, the paper stark white against the dark wood. It was an official-looking document from the Jericho Springs Town Council, which was to say, from Mr. Abernathy. It cited a previously unknown ordinance regarding the proper upkeep and moral tenancy of homesteads, and declared An Lee in violation. It was a flimsy, transparent excuse. The notice gave her 10 days to vacate the premises before the property would be seized. The sheriff, a man named Calloway, whose salary was paid by Abernathy, delivered it himself. He wouldn't meet An Lee's eyes. "It's the law, ma'am," he'd mumbled before scurrying away. An Lee held the paper, the hope that had bloomed in her chest withering into cold dread. She had survived her husband's death, starvation, and the town's scorn, but she could not fight a piece of paper that held the weight of the law, however corrupt. Jonas took the notice from her trembling hands. He read it slowly, his expression grim. He looked at the paper, then at the distant telegraph office at the far end of town. Abernathy had used the law as his weapon. Jonas had brought this trouble to her door. His presence had provoked the man, and now she and her daughters would pay the price. He looked at An Lee, at the despair in her eyes, and a different kind of promise settled in his own. This was a debt he still had to pay. The next morning, Jonas was gone. An Lee awoke to find his bedroll missing and the cabin colder, emptier. The half-chopped woodpile stood as a monument to his abandonment. Despair, thick and suffocating, settled over her. He had left. The story of his debt to Bow had been just that, a story told to ease his conscience before he rode away, leaving her to face Abernathy alone. The town had been right. He was just a drifter. Lynn and Sue felt the change immediately, their brief period of joy extinguished. They clung to her, their small faces etched with fear. For a week she waited, a fool's hope warring with bitter reality. Abernathy swaggered past the cabin daily, his smirk a constant reminder of her impending doom. The townsfolk watched her with a mixture of pity and smug satisfaction. The Chinese widow was finally being put in her place. On the 9th day, Abernathy arrived with Sheriff Calloway and 2 hired men, ready to carry out the eviction. "Time's up, widow," Abernathy declared, gesturing for his men to advance. An Lee stood in the doorway, her daughters hiding behind her skirts. She had no weapon, no defense. She had only the small plot of land that was the last piece of her husband she had left. She braced herself for the end. And then a sound cut through the tense air. The rhythmic beat of horses' hooves, steady and purposeful, coming from the direction of the main road. 2 riders crested the low hill. One was Jonas, sitting tall in his saddle. The other was a man she didn't recognize, a lean, stern-faced individual wearing a dusty coat and a badge that glinted in the winter sun. A U.S. Marshal's star. They rode directly to the cabin, ignoring Abernathy and his men. Jonas dismounted, his face unreadable. The marshal swung down from his horse, his eyes taking in the scene with a cold, assessing gaze. "Sheriff Calloway," the marshal said, his voice carrying an authority that made the local lawman flinch. "I'm Marshal Reed. I received a telegraph from Mr. Jonas here regarding a dispute over a federal homestead claim." Abernathy stepped forward, his face turning a blotchy red. "This is a town matter, Marshal. We have ordinances." "Your town ordinances don't supersede the Homestead Act of 1862, Reed stated flatly. He turned to An Lee. "Ma'am, may I see your husband's filing papers?" An Lee hurried inside and retrieved the precious, worn document from her small wooden chest. Marshal Reed examined it carefully, noting the seal from the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne. He nodded. "This is in order, filed and recorded." He then took the eviction notice from Abernathy. He glanced at it for a second before deliberately tearing it in two, then in four, and letting the pieces flutter to the snow. "This is worthless," he said, his eyes locking onto Abernathy. "This woman is the legal holder of this claim under federal law. Any attempt to remove her is a federal offense, as is using local authority to intimidate a claimant." He looked at Sheriff Calloway. "I trust this matter is now closed." Abernathy stood there, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. He had been beaten, not with a gun, but with a law bigger than his own. He was publicly and utterly defeated. Without another word, he turned and stalked away, his hired men and a deeply humbled sheriff trailing in his wake. Jonas looked at An Lee, a silent question in his eyes. She gave him a small, watery smile, a wave of relief so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. He hadn't abandoned them. He had ridden for help, for the one thing that could save them. He had honored his debt to Bow in a way a gun never could. 6 months later, the bitter Wyoming winter had given way to a warm, generous summer. The small cabin was transformed. A sturdy new porch ran along the front, built by Jonas's hands. Where there had once been only frozen mud, a thriving vegetable garden now grew, its neat rows of corn, beans, and squash a testament to their shared labor. A small flock of chickens scratched in the dirt near a newly built coop. Lynn and Sue, their faces now round and full of health, chased each other through the tall grass, their laughter bright and clear on the afternoon air. Jonas was at the far end of the property, mending a stretch of fence. His gun belt was gone, hung on a peg inside the cabin door, a relic of a life he no longer lived. He still didn't speak much, but his silence had changed. It was no longer a wall of shame or grief, but a comfortable, grounding presence, the quiet rhythm of their new life. An Lee brought him a dipper of cool water from the creek. He stopped his work, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his arm. He took the dipper and drank deeply, his eyes smiling at her over the rim. It was a real smile, one that reached the pale blue of his eyes and softened the hard lines of his face. That evening they sat together on the new porch, watching the sun dip below the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The girls sat between them, practicing their Chinese characters on a small slate, An Lee guiding their hands. Jonas watched them, and in his palm he slowly turned the smooth gray river stone Bow had given him. It had become a part of him, a constant physical reminder of the path that had led him here. He had come to Jericho Springs to pay a debt to a dead man. He had stayed and built a life with the living. This small patch of land, once a place of isolation and hardship, had become a homestead, a home. It was founded not on a legal deed, but on a promise kept, a debt of kindness finally paid in full. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.